6060973 is the number to call. You can text 84850 and you can also do it via Alexa. If you have one, you just say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and it miraculously appears on my screen. Don't ask me how, I don't know, but it does. And you can, of course, watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Jay in St Ives. Hello, Jay.
Good evening, panel. I've got a question. Has Boris Johnson's cabinet been reincarnated by Rishi Sunak?
Has Boris Johnson's cabinet been reincarnated by Rishi Sunak? I've got the list of names in front of me, and Lucy, you could be forgiven for saying that. I mean, there are a couple of, well, 3 new names, but only 3 out of 24. It's kind of shuffling the chairs around a bit, isn't it, rather than bringing in a lot of new blood, like you, for example, who I tipped this morning on the LBC website.
It's very kind of
Mind
you.
you, I've probably jinxed you by doing it.
Very kind of you. No, I think that it's a cabinet that represents the party. So you've got people who supported Boris Johnson, like Nadhim Zahawi, like James Cleverly. You've got people who backed vociferously Liz Truss, like Therese Coffey. You do have some new people. So you've got Gillian Keegan, you've got Victoria Prentice, you've got Jeremy in the Cabinet Office. You've got a range of people. You've also got Jeremy Hunt. I mean, so I think it's a range of talents. I think what Rishi Sunak has done, and massive credit to him, is not only bring in all wings of the party, but he has appointed the right people for the right jobs who've got significant experience. You know, he has appointed big beasts, and I think he will govern extremely well with them.
What about Penny Mordaunt? Because she got nearly 100 MPs to nominate her. And yet she's been kept as leader of the House. She left Downing Street with a face like thunder. I think she could have legitimately demanded one of the top jobs.
Well, she is still in the cabinet. She's got an excellent role, a really important role about getting our legislation through. I know there's a rumour that she wanted to be the Foreign Secretary, but James Cleverly is doing a fantastic job. You know, Penny is extremely talented, but so are those people in the cabinet on your list as well.
Why did he bring back Suella Braverman? Because that is the appointment that's dominating all the media at the moment. She was resigned, or she was sacked. I'm not quite sure what it was, only a week ago, over a security issue. And now she's back. Why?
She said she made an honest mistake. She identified what her mistake was. She apologised for it. She brought it to the attention of the Cabinet Secretary. She resigned, she lost her position. And it's clear that Rishi Sunak has drawn a line under that. She was Home Secretary. She remains Home Secretary. As we were talking about unity, she comes from an important part of the Conservative Party.
So it's about party management.
Well, also
the
policies that she identified that she wanted to drive through. I know that the Prime Minister is also interested in those, and so it is a party of all talents.
But as Home Secretary, you are responsible for the country's security, and yet only 10 days ago she sent a secure document using private email to one of her parliamentary colleagues who is known as one of the biggest gossips in the House of Commons. Well, it's indefensible.
She immediately recognised she'd done something wrong. She admitted her mistake. She lost her job, but there's been a reshuffle, and the Prime Minister has drawn a line under it and has moved on.
Jamie Driscoll, I imagine you agree with all of that.
Yeah, does it come down to personalities? What was the question? Is this Boris Johnson's cabinet reincarnated? From Jay. It's the policy of austerity reincarnated is everything that we hear, and I'm far more interested in that. Lucy might have an interest in the personalities.
Well, personalities are. I mean, Tony Benn was wrong. Personalities are important in politics because if you, like Michael Gove, if you have the personality, you can drive reform through.
But he didn't. There hasn't been any levelling
has in
up.
virtually every department he's been in.
Well, not in this one, because remember, he had the argument with Rishi Sunak about getting money for levelling up and failed. That's why the levelling up white paper was delayed so long. And as a metro, I'm in the middle of that and trying to know what we've got to work with in central government. We don't get any money in it. That's why it's delayed. And they were elected on a mandate of levelling up. There's been no levelling up. £4 million spent in the northeast of England in that entire period of time from levelling up. So, the Labour Party obviously calling for a general election. My opinion is let's have an election. If this is the right people, then let the public decide if this is the right people.
Okay. Martha.
Well, going back to the original question, yes, I think he's reincarnated both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss's cabinets to some extent. Liz Truss's because it shows a measure of continuity at a turbulent time, and Boris Johnson's because he's resurrected the commitment to stick to the 2019 manifesto. But yeah, Suella Braverman really throws a bit of a spanner in the works. I was very surprised by that because, as you say, it throws up two problems. One was the problem that she only resigned 6 days ago over a security issue, and the second problem is that she believes very much in her brief, and she tussled with Liz Truss over the issue of migration. Truss wanted to loosen it a bit to allow for a bit of growth, but Suella pushed back. And so she's lining up all kinds of problems. Did he really need Suella to reach out that much to the right of the party? He's collected such a broad base, as we've been saying. Did he really need to do that? That raises a question of, was there a deal done? Because she did throw her support behind him at a very key time, and maybe what we're seeing is just the result of a deal that's been made.
Now, I can bring you the euphoric news that Sir Gavin Williamson is Minister of State, brackets Minister without portfolio, in the Cabinet Office. Lucy, I have no idea what that even means. Does it mean is he going to be an enforcer figure, do you think?
Well, it means he has a seat at the cabinet table and is sitting in the cabinet office. You may remember that I think Nigel Adams had a similar type role in the cabinet office. You will have to wait and see exactly what Gavin's role is, and I'm sure we'll find that out in due course.
Jonathan Romain.
To answer the original question is, does it matter that a large percentage come from Boris's government? I think from the public's point of view, actually, they don't care. What really matters is, are they going to be competent individuals? Also, to be honest, I don't think most people in the general public will know which MPs backed which contender. That's very much an in-house game. And I would like to disagree with Jamie about the election.
Well, we've got a question on that, so don't disagree with him just now. You can disagree with him in a few minutes.
I'll disagree with him now and later. Right.
In fact, let's go to that question. It's from Paul in Guildford. This is a text question. Are the grown-ups back in the room, or do we need a general election? Well, Jonathan, continue.
I see the argument for a general election. I get the argument, but I think actually it's overridden by two facts. Firstly, I think this is a time, having wasted so much time to really for getting on with the job. And it just makes sense for the people with a new leader in position to have the first go at it. If they fail, obviously, then there has to be a general election. So it makes sense to stay with the current people in post. But also, to be honest, we don't elect PMs. We elect parties, and we elect them on a manifesto. And assuming that Rishi Sunak sticks to the 2019 manifesto, then why should he not lead on it? And of course, that was Liz Truss's big mistake, wasn't it? That she went off-piste and developed this whole ideological nuance, and that led to a cropper. So I'm quite happy for the government to get on with the job and the task ahead.
Jamie, all Labour politicians are calling for a general election. So would I if I was 30 points ahead in the polls. It's a natural thing to do. But as I constantly remind everyone, we don't live in a presidential system. We live in a parliamentary democracy. And Jonathan is right in the logic that he uses there, isn't he?
Jonathan hit the nail on the head when he said, if they deliver the 2019 manifesto, they have a mandate. If they don't do that, they don't have a mandate. So, for example, we have a transport minister here. In that manifesto was the promise to deliver Northern Powerhouse Rail in full. The infrastructure, the train system across the north of England is in chaos. That's one of the things that they're going to do. But that's not what Jeremy Hunt is saying, and it's not what Rishi Sunak is saying. When they talk about difficult choices, they're preparing us for austerity on steroids. They're going to be taking money out of everything that is needed in the North East and the north of England, and the rest of England as well. We don't know that. We had Rishi Sunak, a leaked video, saying the opposite of levelling up, when he was saying, I have surreptitiously diverted money away from poor areas to wealthy areas, and he was caught red-handed in that. So he has...
Quite what he said. I mean, I
he
know this 'cause
changed the funding formulas.
He said that about a mile from where I live. So I did
You've
take
got very
an
good
interest
hearing.
in that. I mean, to be kind to him. No, let me just explain, because I think I understand why you interpret it in that way, and that's how a lot of people did. But I think what he was saying is that even in richer areas, there are pockets of poverty, and we want to deal with those as well. And so it's not just sort of like coastal towns or particular parts of the country that you have to deal with. There are pockets of poverty all over the place. Some of them are hidden.
That would be lovely if that's what he did, but it isn't. They changed the funding formula to take it away from people in severe deprivation. That's the reality. That was not what Boris Johnson's government was elected on in 2019. It was the opposite of that. And I don't think the British people are going to be terribly happy when councils are closing swimming pools, being told to do that by a guy who has a private swimming pool.
Oh, straight between the shoulder blades. Lucy Frazer, obviously you're going to argue against a general election. The question was, are the grown-ups back in the room, or do we need a general election?
Well, I think the points that were made were right. We were elected on a manifesto. We weren't elected with a particular leader, and if that leader left, there should be a general election. We were elected on our 2019 manifesto.
You kind of were, because a lot of people, particularly in some of the areas that Jamie's talking about, a lot of people voted for Boris Johnson. They didn't vote Conservative. Well, they did vote Conservative, but they all said they voted Conservative because of Boris Johnson.
Well, we were elected on a Conservative manifesto. That's a collective document which sets out what the Conservative principles are. And the Prime Minister stood on the steps of Downing Street today and said, we are going to deliver on our manifesto. So that is absolutely what we're going to do. And for that reason, there is no need for a general election.
Martha?
I mean, this is the problem with the rules, isn't it? There's actually no requirement to have a general election whether or not the grown-ups are back in the room and whether or not they diverge significantly from the 2019 manifesto. It would build up a great deal of political pressure, but it wouldn't force them to vote for an election. They don't need to call a general election. I mean, but the problem is with sticking to that manifesto is we're in such a different position than we were in 2019. It's a high spending manifesto that people voted for. Now we're in a situation where that simply is not affordable. Liz Truss tried to do it by borrowing and the market said no. So I suppose there is an argument that really you need to be a bit flexible and respond to events. Sticking to your plan, no matter what the headwinds, is the mistake that Liz Truss made. You need to, yes, stick with your manifesto, but you also need to bend what your policies are to respond to what's happening.
That's an interesting point, Jamie, isn't it? Because, of course, if we think back to 2005, when Tony Blair was elected on a particular manifesto, Gordon Brown then took over in 2007 without a leadership election, it has to be said. And then the financial crash came along. So, of course, that manifesto kind of had to be junked a little bit, didn't it?
It is. Everybody accepts that things are going to change. You know, who predicted the Ukraine war happening when it did? Who predicted COVID? Fair enough. But one of the things is that Liz Truss didn't try that approach. She didn't borrow for investment. She borrowed for unfunded tax cuts, which is what the markets reacted against. It is... What I seriously object to is the idea that there is no alternative to austerity. If you look at what I've done in north of Tyne, we've created thousands of jobs, we're directly tackling child poverty, we're increasing the skills base, we're opening a new railway line, we're doing all the things. For every pound I spend, we return £3 to Treasury. There is a way to do this by actually investing in the productive capacity of Britain, in people's skills, so that they're not struggling in low-paid employment for the rest of their lives. That's what levelling up implicitly promised, and we've not seen any of it, and to be honest, I don't believe we're going to.
Could I just come back on
Very
that?
quickly.
Because I think it's wholly inaccurate, if you don't mind me saying. Because if you remember, our current Prime Minister is our previous Chancellor. And what
I love the way you say our current Prime Minister.
And
current wife.
And what our Prime Minister did in the last budget was ensure that we spent, the spending departments had record sums in order to spend on levelling up, on our schools, on our hospitals.
So why hasn't
he
Jamie
has
seen
done,
any of it?
Well, I think he has seen some of it, but he's not from the Conservative Party, and so he's bound to say that he hasn't. But he absolutely has. Our school funding has gone up. We have record investment into health, in transport. I can tell you, as a transport minister, the significant sums going to roads and rail and to decarbonisation and to the future of transport across the country.
But this is a problem, isn't it? Because I constantly get people who are disabled ringing into the programme saying, well, sort of, we're not getting enough money, our benefits are being cut, they're not going up with inflation. And yet the government tells us that they're spending far more on disability benefits than ever before. And it's sort of, well, both of those things can't be true. And yet it's people at the sharp end, they're telling us their lived experience. And it seems to be the same here, where he's saying he's not getting any money. You're saying, well, yes, you are, because we're spending it all.
Well, first thing is, I'm not an MP and I don't take a party whip. I've a direct mandate. So I'm telling you what I need to do for the people in my area. And if we look at what's happening, we've got record school exclusions. We have record levels of poverty. We have working people queuing up at food banks. That's what really needs to be fixed. And all governments, I will accept, are very good at re-announcing the same money over and over again. And you look at the difference it makes or where it's being spent. And if you look at something like the NHS, there's 20 billion a year being taken out, paid directly to private finance. It's not going in to improving services. That's the sort of thing that makes a difference.
Right, we will come on to more questions in just a moment. You're listening to Cross Question or watching Cross Question on LBC or on Global Player. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
21 minutes past 8. Robert Jenrick, close ally of Rishi Sunak. He's the new immigration minister attending cabinet. Now, with me in the studio answering your questions are Lucy Frazer, KC. I still can't get used to that, can you? I still want to say QC. Conservative MP for South East Cambridgeshire. She's also a transport minister. Jamie Driscoll is Labour Metro Mayor of the North of Tyne Combined Authority. I keep telling you, you need to get a snappier job title, really.
Don't we just?
Just sort of over... I was going to say...
I've renegotiated a Devo deal just to change the title.
Have you? Excellent. Is Hexham in your area?
Hexham is currently.
Excellent. I'm coming to speak at the Literary Festival next year. Martha Gill is freelance political journalist and commentator, and Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain from Maidenhead Synagogue in Berkshire is here too. Now, you've got a book called The Jews of England. I guess it does what it says on the tin. Is there the history of Jews in England?
Yes, it is. And we've been here a long time, although with a hiccup in between. In other words, Jews came here in 1066, largely thanks to William I, who sort of wanted to bring part of his Jewish population over to help him colonise the unruly Saxons. Unfortunately, Edward I had a different opinion and chucked us out. That was in 1290, and then we came back thanks to Cromwell and have been here ever since. So actually, Jews have been here, including my own family, since the 17th century, and we're actually here longer than the actual House of Windsor.
Well, yes, I suppose, because when did that start? It was... Well, it was only called the House of Windsor after the First World War, wasn't it?
Was Saxon Coburg, wasn't it? But anyway, they came somewhere in the 1700s, late 1700s. Or
I think I need to interview you about this book for my book club podcast, but my people will talk to your people. Right, let's go to another call. It's from Kieran in Birmingham. Hello, Kieran.
Yeah, hi there. My question... Hello. Yeah, hi there. So my question is, Rishi said earlier his government will have professionalism, integrity, accountability. He also used the word compassion, which I think is a fine word, beautiful. But a few hours later, he reappointed Suella Braverman as the Home Secretary. And, she was made to resign for breaching her ministerial code only last week. She also described deporting vulnerable asylum seekers who flee war and persecution as her dream. Was she appointed for her compassion and integrity?
Martha.
No, well, I'll just... I sort of made my thoughts on this known earlier, but basically he seems to have a very good reason for appointing Suella Braverman, given that this is the impression that a lot of people will have. My opinion is that was probably a deal. He is known to be quite tough on migration. He might well share her views and hope to avoid the fight that Liz Truss had with Suella over relaxing migration. But then there comes a very important question about how he's going to manage the growth that he talked about.
Jane has texted in a comment and question. She says, will Suella Braverman's dream of plane loads taking off to Rwanda come true under Sunak? This morning, driving to work, I hoped for competent, balanced people being appointed. Coming home, the reappointment of Braverman has dispelled any optimism I might potentially have had as a non-Tory. I'm horrified at this appointment. I think Jane speaks for a lot of people, Lucy.
Well, I'm sorry that she's horrified. I mean, Suella is very experienced. She's been the Attorney General for a number of years. She's been appointed as Home Secretary and has already been in that job before she was appointed to it by Rishi. I think you've also got to look... I mentioned, why she'd been appointed earlier, but there are other things that are important to touch on, because one of the callers mentioned about how compassionate are we. I think we've got some excellent people in excellent roles. I'm just taking Gillian Keegan, for instance. Now got somebody in the education department who herself was an apprentice, who I know cares very deeply about technical education. We've got Mel Stride in DWP, very experienced in Treasury.
Yeah, but you're diverting away from Suella Braverman. Well, I understand why you're doing that.
No, I did answer about Suella and why she was appointed earlier. So I'm happy to reiterate that, which is she made a mistake in what she did, and she apologised for that, and the Prime Minister said we'll draw a line on that. She'd already resigned and obviously taken the consequences of that. We do have an issue in immigration, that we do have to solve. We do need to make sure that people aren't illegally making a journey over here, risking their own lives and those of their children. It's very, very distressing to see people, who are making that tragic journey. who've paid traffic smugglers in order to cross the channel. This is an issue that we do need to solve. And actually, if we can solve it, that would be compassionate, because we would be taking people legally, bringing them here. No one is against immigration. No one is against refugees coming here. But we need to make sure that people do that journey safely.
Jonathan Romain.
Yeah, well, there were two accusations that the caller made against Suella Braverman. One was that she had made a mistake. Well, that's absolutely true. But on the other hand, she, number one, owned up to it immediately, and number two, she resigned. And what a refreshing difference from so many other people we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. So all credit to her. And having paid the price, and probably not expected to come back into Cabinet so quickly, she actually has come back. And I see no problem with that. It's happened in all the parties. I mean, in Labour, it happened with Mandelson, who was forced to resign and then came back in.
Yeah,
so as long as
a couple of years later, not 6 days later.
Well, yes, I know, but that was because
I mean, normally when you resign, you don't come back until you've won your seat again in a general election and the electorate have had their verdict on you. That was certainly the case with Cecil Parkinson back in the 1980s, where Margaret Thatcher had a policy: if someone resigned, they weren't to come back until after the next election.
Fair enough. I think this is somewhat... I mean, I'm not holding a candle out for Suella Braverman, but I think just objectively...
Sounds like it to me.
Well, I'm just saying objectively, it seems if you paid the penalty, and then by accident, and this is a remarkable
But there's
accident,
no penalty. If you're just out of office for 6 days, there's no penalty.
Except she expected to be out of office for the next 2 years. She did expect that. I mean, that was...
Well, I don't know.
But anyway,
maybe that was why she supported Rishi Sunak.
I think, is a point of lack of compassion with immigrants. Because, at the end of the day, Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak both come from families who are themselves immigrants, as did I, for that matter. And there might have been an expectation amongst some that people who are from immigrant families would therefore be more compassionate to the current immigrants. But clearly they're not taking that attitude, and which is, I think, a broader question of they see themselves as British. They don't see themselves as in the American system, partly American, African American, Jewish American, whatever it is. And now, I don't particularly agree with her policy, but it's just fascinating to see the changing dynamics we've got.
Jamie?
I'm all in favour of politicians being pragmatic. I actively support it. So what Rishi Sunak has clearly done is he's done a deal to bring a certain wing of his party on board. Does that mean that he had to necessarily put her into a role which is so controversial, where the role is all about security, and someone who's committed a security breach is going to raise questions? And given that everything that needs to happen in government at the moment is about giving confidence, I think this is a mistake. He'll have done it, as I say, for a deal. But Kieran's call is about compassion. And when you have someone who's dreaming of deporting people to Rwanda, that is so abhorrent that even the plane companies have pulled out and won't do it, then I think this sends a terrible signal. And we really do need to address immigration. Not in the way of wouldn't it be compassionate if we stopped people coming in? I think that's a false equivalency. What we actually need in terms of immigration is a system that allows people to move around the world with appropriate freedoms. It doesn't necessarily mean open door immigration, but we do need skilled people to move into the country. We need people to move out the country. We need people to be reunited in families. And I think this hard line of we must get it down to as close to zero as possible, I think it's A, impractical, and I think it's B, uncompassionate.
Before we go to the news, I'm going to put you all on the spot. I'm going to ask you all the same question that I put to Yvette Cooper about, nearly an hour ago now. I said, Suella Braverman dreams about sending people to Rwanda. What do you all dream about? And just to give you a second to think about that and give an appropriate answer, Yvette Cooper answered that she dreams about 6,000 policemen. Insert your own joke here. Jonathan, let's start with you.
I'm very involved with hosting Ukrainians. I set up a charity called Open Arms, which gives them hosting. I dream that a lot of them who are now coming to the end of their 6-month stay will find new hosts to take them on for the next 6 months.
It's a very worthy dream. Martha, can you be as worthy?
Oh, I don't know. My worthiest dream is...
No, I don't really want your worthiest dream.
Well, actually, the only one that I've come up with is a worthy one because I want to give a very good impression. So my dream... I actually, going back to the 2019 manifesto, I love the rewilding idea. I would love for, a third of the UK to be rewilded. Wouldn't that be
I'm
one?
sensing Theresa May running through wheat fields here.
Yes,
I've got that image of you
I would
running
love
through
that.
wheat fields.
But not wheat fields. That's not
No, that's
rewilding,
not
is it?
rewilding.
It's
You're
got to
absolutely
be
right.
forest, ancient forest.
Okay, Jamie, can you top that?
It's a really trite one that sounds a bit like world peace, but I would love the Ukraine war to end. But if you're talking about...
Are you seriously telling me you've dreamt about the Ukraine war ending? Because I don't believe you.
Well, I don't remember my dreams, so it's a hypothetical question. But is that the thing that I really worry about? Yes, the possibility of nuclear war. All of our disagreements here are immaterial compared to that. So that's the thing I really worry about, that and the climate emergency.
Lucy, rescue us.
I dream that children don't have mental health issues, that they can focus at school, be fulfilled. I used to be the Minister for Youth Justice, and people who drop out of school some of them end up in prison. So I dream that they don't take that path and they go on to be successful.
All I can say is I wish I had as worthy dreams as you.
What's your
dream? No. You don't want to go there. You really don't want to go there. Right, we are going to take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 or tell Alexa, send a comment to LBC. It's 8:32 news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Rishi Sunak's been putting together his cabinet after vowing to fix what he called the mistakes of Liz Truss's leadership. The new Prime Minister has reinstated Suella Braverman as Home Secretary less than a week after she resigned for breaking the ministerial code. Well, the Prime Minister's warned us to prepare for difficult decisions in his first speech outside Number 10 after officially being appointed. Mr Sunak says we're facing a profound economic crisis as a result of the rising cost of living and the conflict in Ukraine. And police are looking for several suspects after a shooting inside a house in East London left 2 people dead. One neighbour in Ilford says the gunshots were masked by Diwali fireworks. LBC weather: rain for most tonight, but staying dry in the southeast, a low of 10 degrees.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36. Andrew Mitchell is back in the government. He's the new International Development Minister. That's the role which replaced his former one of International Development Secretary. Lucy Frazer, Jamie Driscoll, Martha Gill and Rabbi Jonathan Romain here answering your calls. Let's go to a text question from Zach in Redbridge, who says, should Rishi Sunak emulate former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and forego his salary for being PM given his huge personal wealth? Now, I'm told Bloomberg was entitled to $195,000 a year as mayor, but instead got just $1 a year. Jonathan?
No, but on the principle that we would have to then sort of get every PM or cabinet minister to sort of almost do a sort of a beauty test as to their financial background. And it's not about their finances or what they've made or what they've inherited. It's about their competency. So I think this is a recipe for disaster.
Lucy?
Totally agree.
I don't think you should be means tested about whether you're allowed to be Prime Minister. What I do think is an issue, not his personal wealth, but his tax history, given that he was Chancellor and Prime Minister, and money's got to come from somewhere. And there is an issue about his green card and his permanent resident status in the US.
Martha?
No, because it hands on top of his great wealth an extra trump card of anyone who's really wealthy to get a lot of kudos and virtue signalling by foregoing their salary. So yes. No, that's not.
And I think that was the quickest question that we've ever had on Cross Question in terms of your very brief answers.
We all agree with.
Well, let's not continue with that. Let's move on to a caller. Memshi is in Primrose Hill. Hello, Memshi. What would you like to ask?
Hello. I'd like to ask, what might Rishi Sunak intend to do in order to ensure stability about the tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees seeking residency here in the United Kingdom?
Jamie Driscoll, let's come to you first. I don't know how many Ukrainians have settled in the northeast, but presumably quite a few.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same with any immigration crisis. What we're talking about is a mixture of compassion and pragmatic politics, and this requires things like frequently English language classes. It requires changing the rules so people have access to public funds, which it just causes problem for the system. It causes problems for migrants, and everything we can do to make people welcome should they choose to say, bearing in mind that at some point it would be great if Ukraine reaches stability and there's the opportunity for people to return home.
This has kind of fallen off the agenda a bit. I know when the Ukrainian schemes were first set up, and we had the then Minister, Lord Harrington, in the studio, who got a bit of a tough time from our callers. But it seems to have gone off the agenda now. Jonathan, you were mentioning earlier that you've got an interest in this.
Yeah, actually, although there is room for improvement, I think we can all collectively give ourselves a pat on the back, I mean the British people, because, the image of us being Brexit and anti-immigration, and yet really we've welcomed suddenly, I think it's about 145,000 Ukrainians here in a short period. And, that old adage about your home is your castle, well, actually, we've said our home is your home. And we've really opened up not just our hearts, which is sort of easy enough to sort of be sympathetic, but our homes. And it's really quite something to have a stranger in your home. And we all know what it's like at Christmas when you have the relatives for 2 or 3 days, and after 2 or 3 days you're so pleased they leave. But to have a stranger for 6 months, and not just a stranger, but who's often not speaking English properly, and who's traumatised, and who's often got their husband still on the front line in Ukraine, this is a remarkable ask. And you British people, or certainly thousands of them, have opened up their homes, and it's really quite one of the heartwarming stories, and the compassion over here really contrasts with the cruelty over there. And for instance, at my synagogue, we do English lessons every Monday night. We have 60 Ukrainians coming. We're giving out bicycles, and we're encouraging people to give out their bikes, because that's actually a very easy gift to give to Ukrainians, and they need it because they can get to school, they can get to the office, they can get to the job centre, and it also means their hosts don't have to constantly chauffeur. Yes, there has been hiccups over the bureaucracy of getting them here, but it's going ahead, and the government has said this 6 months is minimum 6 months, so some people are staying on with their hosts for much longer, and the £350 a month grant the government is giving is also continuing, whether it's with the existing hosts or new hosts who come along.
Martha?
It's really interesting, isn't it, the contrast? I think what we always see when it comes to refugees, whether the refugees from Syria a few years ago and then Afghanistan and now Ukraine, is a sort of outburst of welcoming. While the horrific events are in the news, people want vast acceptance to be made in the policies for these people that they feel so much sympathy for, and open their homes and hearts to them in a very heartwarming way. But when it drifts off the agenda, we kind of revert back to this state where a majority, or polling shows that lots of people dislike the general idea in the abstract of too many people coming here. So this is a really difficult thing for governments to balance. And there is a danger that when it drifts off the agenda, as you just said it has, Iain, that we start to revert back to default, which is, no, we don't want people coming here. So actually, it might be the case that, as we saw with the Syrian and Afghani refugees, after a couple of years, what happens, though all of those schemes that were promised with great enthusiasm at the start have drifted off the agenda and kind of broken down. If you look at the things that were promised those refugees, they no longer really exist. So that's something that the government has to look at very carefully and make sure that it's being consistent and not just responding to popular reaction.
Lucy.
I've been really humbled by the British people and the response that we've had. I mean, my constituency, we've had hundreds of people who've acted as sponsors, and did an event for them recently where they came and the people they were hosting came. And it's really remarkable how much people are not just hosting them, they're helping and supporting them into jobs, getting their children into schools. So I think the British people have done a tremendous thing, supported by the government, because it was the government that set up the scheme, the Homes for Ukrainians scheme, as well as done a number of things to support families who are sponsors. I think it's really important that we integrate the Ukrainians into society. Make sure, I mean, I visited the job centre, make sure that we are ensuring if they want to work, they can work. If they're going to stay, they have jobs, because that will stop people feeling some sort of resentment about.
But why, if Ukrainians are allowed to work, why aren't people who are going through the asylum system allowed to work? I mean, why aren't people from Syria, Afghanistan, Iran allowed to work? It seems a bit incongruous.
Well, they've all they've gone through the system. They're not here illegally. They have liberty to work, and it is good, I think, that they work in order that they feel that they're contributing and they feel at home.
Mimshi, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much. Let's go to another text question from Roger, who says, does the arrest of Peter... Actually, before I do that, I'm just looking at the time. Let's take a quick break before we answer Roger's question, because it's a really, really interesting one. It involves Peter Tatchell. You might have seen what has happened to him today. It's 8:45.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:49. Lucy Frazer, Jamie Driscoll, Martha Gill and Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain are here. Jonathan tells me his book, The Jews of England, is actually 15 years old. I was mistakenly under the impression it was a new book, but he has got a new one out. And it's got the rather alluring title of The Naked Rabbi, His Colourful Life, Campaigns and Controversies by Jonathan Romain. I'd love to ask you exactly what it's all about, but I'm not going to because we've got to fit 3 questions in 11 minutes now. Is that all right? Next programme. I will have you on my book club podcast. Right, next question is from Roger. Does the arrest of Peter Tatchell today for holding the first ever LGBT rights protest in Qatar ahead of the Football World Cup show that direct action is the right thing to do and that Just Stop Oil protesters here are doing the right thing despite the disruption they're causing? Jamie Driscoll.
I think Peter Tatchell's extraordinarily brave, and eventually things change only because people protest if nobody's listening. So when Extinction Rebellion, going back a year or two, do you remember they did that spectacular bamboo sculpture to blockade the print works of Murdoch's newspapers? I was one of the few politicians who says this is legitimate protest, and if they're going to be arrested and charged, they'll be arrested and charged. You don't need to change the law. So, you can go back to the suffragettes, the civil rights movements in America. Protest is morally justified. Are these effective protests is what I would ask. And I think Just Stop Oil, if they are alienating people from supporting their cause, I think that's more that I don't agree with their tactics rather than the right to protest over something which is existential. The climate emergency will wipe us out if we don't deal with it.
Martha.
I agree that that protest has to be effective. I think that there are a lot of people who always find protest extremely annoying, however you do it. I mean, that's the point of protest, isn't it? To disrupt things, to get in the way, and to cause people to either think about it or to have to stop in their tracks and see their point. I mean, I think some of these protests have been quite inventive. I quite liked the Van Gogh.
Please!
I thought it made a very good point.
Right now,
it did. Okay, it did absolutely nothing to damage the picture, which they knew.
Well, they threw tomato soup over it, so clearly.
Well, they threw it on a plastic cover, on a glass cover over it, and it made a striking image and an interesting point about destruction and what we value and what's being destroyed, and how people react viscerally.
What about chucking a cake in the face of the Prince Charles waxwork at Madame Tussauds? I mean, what on earth was that all about?
But the thing is, that's better, isn't it, than blockading roads? People might prefer that to blockading roads, right? That's a striking. Okay, the thing is, I suppose in this case they have maybe taken it a bit far and maybe are alienating people. But once you start picking protests apart, where do you stop? All protests are very annoying.
I think there is a clear dividing line, actually, between grabbing attention, even if it's annoying, and even if it annoys you, Iain, like at the Van Gogh or the Madame Tussauds, which doesn't actually harm anybody, may annoy, and actually blocking the M25 when you're actually endangering people who've got ambulances or all sorts of things to go. So there is a distinction in the level of protest.
Yeah.
But I want to echo the point about bravery, because at the end of the day, the people at Madame Tussauds or even the M25, they just get unglued by the police with nice soapy suds, they get a cup of tea and then they're let off the next day. What's going to happen in Peter Tatchell in Qatar? Very different story. So that is an act of personal bravery that stands above and beyond.
Absolutely. And I would love Gary Neville and David Beckham and anybody else who's making a lot of money out of the Qatar World Cup from the Qataris to sit down with Peter Tatchell so he can explain to you, Gary Neville, why you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. Lucy.
I think people care about a number of things, and it's absolutely right that they should be able to campaign on them and get their voices heard. As an MP, obviously, I'm the recipient of many campaigns regularly, and it's really important that people have that opportunity to put forward their views. But I think when you start disrupting legitimate businesses who are earning money, when you stop people getting to school, to hospital, you create real disruption. I think there's something wrong with that. And I think that we need to crack down on that. And I do think the government has listened to the impact of climate change and is acting on it. So it's not like something is happening and the government has closed its ears. You know, we have a target in relation to net zero, and we're taking a number of measures in order to get there.
Well, can I just say fracking and 110 oil exploration licences, that doesn't look like listening very much.
Paul says, as a football fan, Iain, are you and your partner going to the Qatar World Cup? If you knew my partner, you'd know the answer to that question would be no, because the word football in our house is always preceded by the word bloody or something worse. So no, neither of us will be going for many reasons. Kelly in Harlow says, elsewhere in the world, they're getting on with proper policy. Macron has asked a panel of French citizens to help decide if France should legalise assisted dying. Why are we so scared of having this debate in the UK? I'm not so sure we are, because there's been various initiatives in the House of Lords on that in recent years, and we certainly have the debate on this programme quite often. Jonathan, what's your view on assisted dying?
I'm very much in favour of assisted dying within strict parameters. In other words, if somebody is terminally ill, so they are dying anyway, and they are mentally competent and they're in pain or distress, I see absolutely no reason why somebody else should say, thou shalt live on in pain and suffer. Obviously, it's different if they're not terminally ill. If someone's in their 40s and depressed and going through a bad patch, no. But why are we forcing people to live on against their will and causing them pain? I can see no logic to it. There's no sanctity in suffering. There's nothing holy about agony. So from a religious perspective, I would say that people have the right to end a life that is already about to end.
Lucy, do you think this is climbing up the political agenda? I mean, it would be seen as a conscience issue, so political parties, I don't think, have stances on this. What's your view?
Well, you're right. We're not shying away from this subject. We have had a debate on it in Parliament whilst I've been an MP, and we voted on it a number of years ago. I voted in favour of assisted dying. It was within limited parameters, as Jonathan mentions. It is a conscience issue, so it's not something the government is going to bring forward, but there are opportunities for MPs and members of the House of Lords to put forward their own agendas. And I know there's an active campaign on this issue. I'm sure it will resurrect itself at some time.
Very, very soon, because there's a bill actually in Holyrood which is going ahead in 2023 and with a good chance of passing, and that may well then influence events down in England.
Because a lot of social reforms over the years have not been government-inspired. If you look at a lot of the 60s legislation on reforming the abortion law, homosexuality, divorce, etc., they all started as private members' bills, and the government then decided to effectively tacitly support them. Jamie?
Yeah, I very much agree with Jonathan's position. I'm not a religious person, but very much believe that people should have the freedom of determination in pretty much all aspects of their lives where they are not hurting others.
Martha?
Well, I agree in principle, but there's something very interesting happening in Canada where assisted dying is legal, and they are gradually expanding the number of people who can choose this as an option. Next year, it will be people who suffer just from mental illness. There's also a motion for mature minors to make the decision. So there is actually a risk. We've seen this. There's an experiment going on in Canada, and there is a gradual expansion, a slippery slope that we all sort of think, oh, well, we can manage if we put it in proper limits, going on. And there is always, and that is the other side of the debate, isn't it, that once you allow this in policy, people who really shouldn't be considering this will consider it. And so you really do have to be very careful, and I think we should look at what's happening in Canada before we do anything to...
No, because that only happens because the MPs or legislators allow that to happen and broaden the parameters. If you want to look somewhere, you should look at Oregon, which introduced assisted dying 25 years ago and has kept exactly to those rules. So it's possible not to change the rules unless people actually wish to do so. So really, if we ever did this in England, which I hope we will, we're not going to leap into the dark. We're going to actually be imitating exactly what's happened for the last quarter of a century in Oregon.
Yeah, well, we hope we can always trust the politicians to do the right thing, can't we? But yeah, I agree. I agree with you on principle. I think it has to be done for everyone.
I would also say that suicide is actually very prevalent. And if you have to engage with medical professionals to do that, you are likely to get treatment in a way that you're not if you end up sadly throwing yourself off a bridge or taking an overdose.
Well, that's the real point, that all the options at the moment are bad options. In other words, you either have to carry on and suffer in pain, or you commit suicide, which is often botched and certainly horrible for the relatives to have to pick up, or you try and go abroad to Dignitas, which is expensive, and it means also you have to do it while you're much better than you would otherwise have to do so.
It is interesting. Whenever we talked about this subject on the programme and people phone in, it's one of those subjects where as a presenter, you're slightly nervous about, but you get the most amazing calls from people, and really heartfelt, and people I remember the last time we talked about it, we had somebody who was, I think, literally, or a relative, was about to take their family member to Dignitas, and it doesn't get more emotional than that. Now, if you need to talk to someone about difficult feelings or thoughts that you're having, you can always call the Samaritans on 116 123. They're free to call all day and all night, 116 123. Now, let's have a final text question from Chris in Hawley. He says, I'm sad at the news that Ford are discontinuing the Fiesta after 46 years. My first car was a purple Fiesta. So, panel, what was yours? I'll give you a moment to remember. Mine was a bright orange Ford Cortina Mark III, which I had at university. It was universally known as the Big Jaffa, and I wrote it off on my 20th birthday, hitting a transit van head-on at 50 miles an hour in the days before seatbelts. Lucy?
Well, the texter is in good company, because mine was also a Ford Fiesta, a white Ford Fiesta, which had this really exciting sunroof I could take totally down.
Was an XL2?
Hinges. Oh, I don't know what it was, but it was freedom for me, because we lived in a place that didn't have much public transport, and it was total freedom, and I loved it.
Jamie?
Mine was a black Mark II Ford Escort, and I had to park it at the top of a hill and jump in and push it to get it to start on a morning. And that may have led me to being an engineer and getting an engineering degree, because I went to a breaker's yard and learned how to swap the starter motor and everything else. You could do that with cars in those days.
You can't now.
These days you can't.
No, absolutely. Martha?
I don't know how many of my generation I represent, maybe those who live in London, who've lived in London since university, but I don't drive. I've never had a first car.
Moving on to Jonathan.
Well, I have to admit, I am totally disinterested in cars. I can never remember what car I have. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and say my dream as a country rabbi in sort of rural Berkshire is actually to have a horse and go clip-clop, clip-clop, a la Dr. Johnson, visiting my parishioners.
I can imagine you doing that, but I do feel sorry for the horse. Thank you very much to everyone. Lucy Frazer, Jamie Driscoll, Martha Gill and Dr. Jonathan Romain. His book is called The Naked Rabbi, His Colourful Life, Campaigns and Controversies. You'll hear that on the Indale Book Club within the next few weeks, hopefully. Right, in the next hour, we're going to continue our discussion about Rishi Sunak and his new government. What does it signal to you, these appointments that he's made? Is it continuity Boris Johnson, as someone suggested in this hour? Or do you think that the appointment of Suella Braverman just overshadows the whole thing? Or is this the right team to take the Conservatives to win the next election? He said controversially. It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Rishi Sunak's been putting together his cabinet after vowing to fix what he called the mistakes of Liz Truss's leadership. The new Prime Minister has reinstated Suella Braverman